There is a door. You have been knocking on it for a long time. Months, maybe, or years. You knock politely at first, the way you were taught to pray. Then louder. Then with both fists. And then one night you stopped knocking, not because you gave up, but because your hands were tired and the silence on the other side had become a kind of answer you didn't and oppose. Know how to live with. You are not the first person to stand at that door. Every person in this video stood there too. A prophet who screamed at the sky and got nothing back. A priest and his wife who prayed the same prayer for 40 years. A mother walking behind the body of her only son. A teenager thrown into a pit by his own brothers. And two sisters who sent word to the one man who could have saved their brother and watched him not come. This is not a video about how to be more patient. This is not a video about waiting with a better attitude. This is not a video about the spiritual discipline of trust. This is a video about what God is actually doing while you wait, and why the delay is not what you think it is. There is a tomb, for days old. The smell has already reached the people standing outside it. And the man walking toward that tomb already knows exactly what he is going to do when he gets there. We will get to that tomb, but not yet. First, you need to understand something about time. The Greeks had two words for it. The first is chronos, the ticking kind. Seconds, minutes, hours, the kind of time that runs out, the kind measured by clocks and calendars, and the number of days since the last time God seemed close. Chronos is the time you live in. The time that feels long when you are waiting and short when you are afraid. The second word is kairos. It means something closer to the right moment. The appointed time. Not a duration, a decision. Kairos is not measured in minutes. It is measured in meaning. Here is what changes everything. You have been measuring God and Apos, S response in Chronos. He has been working in Kairos. And those two clocks do not run at the same speed. 5 people. 5 moments where the silence stretched so long it started to feel like an answer. And 5 times God showed up in a way that could not have happened one day earlier. Stay with me. Because the first person we need to meet was not patient. He was furious. And God answered him anyway. His name is Habakkuk. 3 chapters. Near the end of the Old Testament. Wedged between prophets with more famous names. Easy to skip. Almost nobody stops there. But Habakkuk did something no other prophet in Scripture did quite so directly. He did not bring God a message. He brought God a complaint. How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? That is the first line of his book. Not a doxology. Not a vision. A question that sounds less like a sermon and more like a man at the end of his rope, shouting into a sky that has gone completely quiet. Habakkuk was watching violence spread through his nation. He was watching injustice go unpunished. He was watching everything he believed about God collide with everything he could see with his own eyes, and the collision was not going well for his theology. So he did what most of us are afraid to do. He said it out loud. He stood at his watchtower. The text actually says he climbed up to his post and waited to see what God would say, and he argued. Here in Apos, that's what most people miss. God did not rebuke him for it. God answered, not with a timetable, not with an explanation that made the suffering make sense. God answered with a single sentence that has carried more people through more dark seasons than almost any other line in Scripture. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. Read that slowly. God is not saying it will come soon. He is not saying the pain will end by Friday. He is saying something harder and stranger than that. He is saying it will arrive at the exact moment it was always supposed to arrive. Not one day late. Not one day early. The delay you feel is not a malfunction. It is the mechanism. Habakkuk ends his tiny book not with answers, but with a song. The circumstances have not changed. The violence is still there. But Habakkuk has changed. He writes, Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. Not because the problem is solved. Because he has seen enough of who God is to trust what God is doing. That is not blind faith. That is faith that has been through something. And those two things are not the same. But it gets stranger. Because sometimes God does not just delay the answer. Sometimes God delays the entire life. Zechariah was a priest in the Jerusalem temple, an honorable man. The text tells us, blameless before God. His wife Elizabeth was the same. And they had prayed, for years that became decades, for a child. By the time our story begins they are old. The word Luke uses suggests not just middle age, but the kind of old where hope has quietly folded up and found somewhere else to live. One day Zechariah was chosen by Lot to enter the inner sanctuary and burn incense, a once-in-a-lifetime honor for a temple priest. He went in alone, and the angel Gabriel was standing at the right side of the altar. Gabriel told him, "Your prayer has been heard. Elizabeth will bear a son. His name will be John." Zechariah and Apos' response is one of the most human moments in the entire New Testament. He said, "How can I be sure of this? I am an old man, and my wife is well along in years. You have waited your whole life for this answer, and the moment it arrives you ask for proof. Of course you do. Because hope deferred does something to a person. It does not just delay the dream. It erodes the ability to receive it. The Hebrew word yada, to know, carries a meaning deeper than information. When the scriptures say God knows your situation, it does not mean he has logged it in a database. It means he is intimately, personally, relationally acquainted with it. Every year of Zechariah and Elizabeth and Apos' waiting was known that way. Not filed. Known. And their son, this child born to elderly parents after a lifetime of closed doors, became John the Baptist, the voice in the wilderness, the one Isaiah predicted 700 years earlier, the one whose entire purpose was to arrive at a precise moment in history and say, "He is coming. Get ready." If Elizabeth had conceived 20 years earlier, John would have been 20 years too old. The delay was not punishment. It was positioning. Their son had to be born at exactly the right moment to introduce the Messiah at exactly the right moment, and the Kairos clock had been running the whole time. But sometimes God does not delay the answer to reposition the person. Sometimes he delays it to reposition an entire generation. And sometimes he does not delay at all. Now watch what happens next. Jesus and his disciples are walking toward a town called Nain. A crowd is with them. And coming out of the town gate is another crowd, moving in the opposite direction, following a young man and Apos' body on a stretcher toward burial. Luke tells us his mother was a widow. That one detail carries the full weight of first-century economics. No husband. Now no son. In that world, in that culture, this woman has just lost everything that stood between her and destitution. She has no name in the text. She does not need one. You already know her. You have seen her face in someone you love. Nobody asked Jesus to stop. Nobody said a word to him. He saw her. The text says he saw her, and his heart went out to her. The Greek word Luke uses is esplankness. It means something closer to gut-wrenching compassion, the kind that moves through your whole body before your mind decides what to do. He said, "Don and Apos, cry." Then he walked to the stretcher and touched it. The procession stopped. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." The dead man sat up and began to talk. She had not prayed for this. She had not asked for this. She was walking to a burial, not to a miracle. But the road to the burial was the road the miracle was already walking down. 3 people. 3 different kinds of waiting. A prophet with unanswered questions. A couple with an unanswered prayer. A mother with an unanswered grief. And in every single case, what looked like God and Apos' absence was God and Apos' architecture. We are not done yet. The next 2 stories go deeper. One is about a teenager thrown into a pit who will spend 13 years in the dark before he understands what the darkness was for. And the other is about a tomb. The one I mentioned at the beginning. If this is landing somewhere close to home, if you are in the middle of a wait that has gone on longer than you thought you could survive, I want you to stay. Subscribe if you Haven and Apos, and leave a comment below telling me where you are in the waiting. Because you are not the only one standing at that door. The best part is still ahead. And it involves a tomb. The year is somewhere around 1700 BC. A 17-year-old boy is sitting at the bottom of a dry cistern in the Dothan Valley, listening to his brothers eat lunch above him. They had thrown him in first, then sat down to eat. That detail is in the text, Genesis 37, verse 25. They threw their brother into a pit, and then had a meal, which tells you something about how far things had gone between them. Joseph had not been subtle about being the favorite. He had not been quiet about his dreams where his brothers bowed down to him, where the sun and moon and 11 stars curved toward him in deference. He was 17. He told everyone, and his brothers had been storing that resentment for years. So they threw him in the pit. Then they sold him to a passing caravan of Ishmaelite traders heading to Egypt, 20 pieces of silver, the going rate for a young male slave. Then they went home, dipped his coat in goat and Apos' blood, and handed it to their father. And Jacob, the man who had himself deceived his own father, was now deceived by his sons. He tore his clothes and mourned for years. Joseph arrived in Egypt with nothing. No family, no language, no rights, no name that meant anything to anyone in that country. Pay attention to this, because here is where most people skip ahead to the part where everything works out. But you need to stay in the dark a little longer, because this is where the story actually happens. Joseph was sold to a man named Potiphar, an official in Pharaoh and Apos' court. He worked hard. He rose to the top of Potiphar and Apos' household. Then Potiphar and Apos' wife accused him of something he did not do, and he was thrown into prison. 13 years. From the pit in Dothan to the prison in Egypt. 13 years of being handed consequences for other people and Apos' choices. 13 years of waking up in the wrong country, in the wrong cell, with the wrong name on someone else and Apos' ledger. And here's the thing that has always stopped me cold when I read this. There is not a single verse in those 13 years where Joseph asks God to get him out. Not one recorded prayer for rescue. Not one lament that sounds like Habakkuk and Apos'. What the text records instead is simpler and somehow harder. It says, again and again, that the Lord was with Joseph. That Joseph found favor. That whatever Joseph was given to do, he did it with everything he had. He waited the way you wait when every door has been shut long enough that you stop checking them. He worked. He served. He was faithful inside a situation he did not choose and could not change. And this is where it gets remarkable. Pharaoh had a dream. 2 dreams. Actually, 7 fat cows devoured by 7 thin ones. 7 healthy heads of grain swallowed by 7 scorched ones. His magicians could not explain them. His wise men had nothing. And then, a cupbearer who had once shared a prison cell with a Hebrew slave suddenly remembered something. There is a man, he said, in the prison. He interprets dreams. Joseph was brought out of the dungeon, given a shave and a change of clothes, and stood before the most powerful ruler in the known world. He listened to the dreams. He gave the interpretation, 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine so severe it would consume the land. Then he offered a plan, unsolicited, for how Egypt could survive it. Pharaoh looked at his officials and asked, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" That morning Joseph had been a prisoner. By afternoon he was second in command of Egypt. Pharaoh put his own signet ring on Joseph and Apos' finger. He gave him fine linen robes and a gold chain. He gave him a chariot and a name, Zaphanath-Paneah, and a wife from a priestly family. Joseph was 30 years old. 13 years. And then one morning, one dream, one man who remembered, and the Kairos clock struck. Now here is what the delay actually cost, and what it actually purchased. If Joseph had gotten out of that prison in year 1, he goes home. He reconciles with his brothers. He lives a quiet life in Canaan. And 7 years later, when the famine hits the entire ancient Near East, there is no stored grain in Egypt. There is no plan. And the people who will eventually become the nation of Israel, Joseph and Apos' own family, starve. Josephus, writing in his Jewish Antiquities, describes Joseph as a man of extraordinary soul who was broken before he was built. That is not an accident of biography. That is a pattern. Joseph and Apos' 13 years of waiting were not wasted years. They were the years that put him in the exact building, in the exact country, in the exact position to save the exact people he needed to save, including the brothers who sold him, and the father who mourned him, and a nation that did not yet exist, but would carry his bones out of Egypt 400 years later because he made them promise. He did not end up in Egypt despite his suffering. He ended up in Egypt because of it. The pit was not a detour. The pit was the road. Now we get to the tomb, the one I mentioned at the beginning, 4 days old, and the man walking toward it already knows what he is going to do when he gets there. But before we get to what he does, we need to sit for a moment in what happened before he came, because this is the part of the story that is almost never preached. Mary and Martha did not ask Jesus for a miracle. Read it again slowly, John chapter 11, verse 3. They sent him a message that said, "Lord, the one you love is sick." That is all. No request. No instruction. No list of what they needed him to do. Just, the one you love is sick. Come. They trusted him enough to just tell him the truth. And John records what happened next in a sequence of words so strange that theologians have been sitting with them for 2,000 years. Verse 5. Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Verse 6. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. So, that word, that single conjunction carrying the full weight of a theology that does not make sense to a chronos mind. Because of his love, he waited. Not in spite of it. Because of it. He did not misread the situation. He did not get distracted. He did not arrive and say, "Oh, I didn't endopos. Realize it had gotten this bad." He knew. He told his disciples plainly, "Lazarus is dead." And then he said something that should stop you cold. He said, "And for your sake I am glad I was not there." Glad. Not relieved. Not resigned. Glad. Because what was about to happen required the full darkness to make the full light visible. Here endopos, that's the part nobody tells you. The Jewish understanding in the 1st century held that the soul lingered near the body for 3 days after death. Close enough, perhaps, that restoration was still conceivable. By day 4, that window was considered closed. The rabbinical tradition was specific about this. Day 4 meant finished. Day 4 meant the decomposition had begun, the soul had departed, and whatever you were hoping for was no longer available. Jesus arrived on day 4. Deliberately. Precisely. The Greek word John uses when Martha meets him on the road. Eid, already. Lord, if you had been here, he would not have died. But even now, she says, as if she is not sure what she is asking for, as if hope is a word she is holding very carefully because it has been dropped so many times before. Even now, Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." She thought he meant the resurrection at the end of time. The safe theological answer. The one that is true but distant. And Jesus looked at her and said something that collapsed the distance entirely. "I am the resurrection and the life." Not, "I will cause a resurrection." Not, "I have access to resurrection power." I am it. Present tense. Standing in front of you. On this road. Right now. Then he asked where they had laid him. And they took him there. And when Jesus saw Mary weeping, and the people who had come with her weeping, John records the shortest verse in the entire Bible. Jesus wept. 2 words. The shortest sentence in Scripture. And the heaviest. Because he already knew what he was about to do. He knew that in 4 minutes Lazarus would be walking out of that tomb. He knew that the grief in that courtyard was about to be shattered by something nobody in human history had ever witnessed. He knew all of it. And he still wept. Because your pain is not a problem to be managed on the way to the miracle. Your grief is real to him. Not as data, not as a file to be processed, but the way the Hebrew word yada means real. Intimately. Personally. In his body. He wept. Then he walked to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. He said, "Take away the stone." Martha, practical to the end, said, "Lord, by this time there is a bad odor. He has been there 4 days." And Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" They took away the stone. He looked up and prayed. Not a long prayer, not a desperate prayer, a prayer of someone speaking to a person they are already in constant conversation with. Then he called out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." And the dead man came out, bound hand and foot with strips of linen, a cloth still around his face, walking, alive, blinking in the light of a world he had left 4 days ago. Think about what it took to get to that moment. Mary and Martha had to lose their brother. They had to send the message and wait. They had to watch him die. They had to wrap his body and seal the tomb and sit in that house for 4 days with the silence and the smell and the neighbors coming in and out with food nobody was eating. All of it. Every hour of it was necessary. Not because God is cruel. Not because suffering is good in itself. But because some miracles can only be witnessed in full daylight, and the full daylight only comes after the full dark. Now think about where you are right now. Maybe you are in day 1 of something. Maybe you are in year 4. Maybe you sent the message a long time ago, the one that said, "Lord, the one you love is hurting." And you have been watching the silence ever since, checking the door, listening for footsteps that have not come. Lazarus did not know, in that tomb, that Jesus was on the road. He did not know the delay had a purpose. He did not know that his death was going to be the moment that changed what people understood about who Jesus was. A moment so significant that John puts it as the direct catalyst for the religious leaders finally deciding Jesus had to die. which set in motion the events that led to the cross, which led to the resurrection, which is the reason you are watching this video right now. Lazarus dying was load-bearing. His 4 days in the tomb held up something he could not see from inside it. There is a room in a hospital somewhere tonight. Fluorescent lights. A chair that is not made for sleeping. A phone that has not rung with the news you need. 3 in the morning, and the God who promises to answer feels very far away, and the silence has taken on a weight you did not know silence could have. You are not forgotten in that room. You are not abandoned. You are not outside the story. You are in day 4. And the man who wept at a tomb is already on the road. 5 people. 5 different kinds of waiting. 5 different kinds of dark. A prophet who screamed at a silent sky and discovered that God and Apos' answer is not always a timetable, but always a presence. A priest and his wife who prayed the same prayer for 40 years and whose answer arrived exactly late enough to change the entire history of salvation. A mother walking behind her son and Apos' body who never asked for a miracle and met one on a road she had walked 100 times before. A teenager in a pit who spent 13 years in the wrong country in the wrong prison doing the right things and woke up one morning as the second most powerful man in the known world. And 2 sisters who trusted Jesus enough to just tell him the truth and watched him weep before he worked. Here is what every single one of those stories is telling you. First, God and Apos' delays are not God and Apos' denials. Every story in this video ends with something that could not have happened any other way, at any other time. The delay was not a malfunction. It was the method. Second, the silence you are sitting in right now is not empty. Chronos feels long. Kairos is working. You cannot see what is being built in the waiting because you are inside it. But you are inside it, not outside it, not forgotten beside it. Inside the story, in the middle of the construction, surrounded by a God who is not slow by your standards, but is moving by his own. And third, and this is the one I want you to carry out of this video and into whatever room you walk back into tonight. Jesus did not arrive at the tomb of Lazarus and offer an explanation. He did not arrive with an apology. He did not sit down beside Mary and Martha and walk them through a theological framework for why good people suffer and why prayer sometimes goes unanswered for 4 days or 4 years or 4 decades. He arrived. He wept. He called a dead man by name. And the dead man walked out. That is who is on the road toward whatever you have sealed up and given up on and stopped believing can change. Not a doctrine. Not a framework. Not a theological position on divine timing. A person walking toward your tomb, already knowing your name, already knowing what he is going to say when he gets there. The door you have been knocking on. He is not on the other side of it, waiting for you to knock the right way. He is on the road. He is already moving. And he is not late. He is never late. Which of these 5 stories is closest to where you are right now? Habakkuk and Apos' unanswered question, Elizabeth and Apos' unanswered prayer, the widow and Apos' unanswered grief, Joseph and Apos' unanswered years, or Mary and Martha and Apos' unanswered silence. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If this video found you at the right moment, you already know why. Share it with someone who is in the waiting. And I will see you in the next one, whenever you are ready.